Now, according to the latest report from the Debt Management Office, Nigeria's debt-to-GDP ratio rose to 23.3% in the first quarter of 2022. That's compared to 22.47% as of December 2021. While this is lower than the self-imposed limit of 40%, the rate is quickened faster due to the increased borrowing and tepid economic growth. The DMO, in its quarterly public debt profile report, disclosed that the country's total public debt stock, which includes new domestic borrowings by the federal government used to partly finance the 2022 budget deficit, rose by 41.6 trillion naira in the first quarter of 2022, representing a 2.05 trillion naira increase compared to 39.56 trillion naira recorded as of December last year. Although government have argued that the conditions is not a debt problem, but a revenue challenge, but the truth is debt becomes a problem if the revenue base is not strong enough to service the debt sustainability. Well, let me leave an expert to make us understand this. And we have him live in our studio, tax manager and economist at PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, Mr. Abiodun Ali. Thank you so much for your time. It's good to have you live in the studio. Yes, 41.6 trillion naira compared to 39.56 trillion naira. Now, how problematic is this rising figure? To look at what it means, is it the management of the economy? What does this mean for us?
Okay, it's quite worrying, to be honest with you. And that 41 trillion that we're looking at, if you want to look at it in terms of per capita, what that simply means is that if you divide that 41 trillion by 200 million people, it means every single person is going to be owing about 205,000 naira. That's the simple implication. So it's quite worrying. And you know, there is this comment that the World Bank has said, and what they've simply said is that debt is like a two-edged sword, right? So if you use it rightly, if developing countries are using it rightly, it simply means that they will be able to use that particular amount that they borrow. If they channel it into critical infrastructure, they'll be able to generate income, and from there the growth rate would also increase, and it will lead to development through its trickle-down effect. But if you're unable to use it as you should, what you simply find out is that you are in a situation whereby you have what is called a debt overhang. You've incurred too much debt, you can't sustain it any longer, or you simply cannot finance that debt. Simply, that's what it means. If you then consider the history of Nigeria, you want to go back to the time of 2004. You know, if you remember the debt forgiveness we obtained in 2005, June 2005 to be precise, as of December 2004, our debt stock then, right, our external debt stock was somewhere around $36 billion, but we got that debt pardon of about $18 billion. Now, if you even convert that $36 billion to naira, you know, the exchange rate at that point in time was somewhere around 134 naira to the dollar. If you convert it to naira, you're looking at 4 trillion naira. After that debt forgiveness, the 50% debt forgiveness that we got then, now imagine our total external debt stock is still at 39 billion, even as at current times. Now the exchange rate is something else. It's 416 naira to the dollar. If you then multiply it by that amount, you see that we currently have a total external debt stock converted to naira of something around the range of 13 trillion. That's quite a lot, and it's quite worrying. Well, you can understand that given the current circumstances, what is going on in the global economy, it's not just Nigeria that is impacted. It's mostly developing nations and even advanced nations of the world that are going through troublesome times at the moment.
But let's move forward. The IMF has projected that this debt will rise, and I think the federal government has their own, the Debt Management Office has their own projection. What's your assessment of the forecast versus statements from the Debt Management Office?
Okay, yes, it's quite understanding. I think the IMF, they had this projection that if we continue at this pace towards 2027, we're going to have the debt to GDP ratio inching up to somewhere around 44%, right? And I think the DMO, they are confident at the moment that we are still doing below the 40% threshold they had actually set for themselves. Well, if you look at some of the thresholds that have also been set by bodies and organizations, at the moment we're actually doing something low. If you look at the ECOWAS, for instance, ECOWAS has the threshold of debt to GDP somewhere around 70%. Then if you look at the World Bank expects it to be 55% for emerging economies, right? So the point here is that at the moment, I think personally that Nigeria still stands a good chance as long as you are able to grow the GDP, because the debt to GDP, you are simply looking at it in terms of potential, right? So as long as that GDP is growing, you will be able to, let's just say you have the potential to actually take care of your debt. But in the actual sense of it, like most economists and analysts have said, you are actually not going to finance your debt from the GDP. That's just the potential. And if you look at our GDP at the moment, you see small businesses, for instance, small businesses who are earning probably 25 million naira and below, they won't pay CIT, right? So if you consider some of these benefits and you realize that, okay, maybe the federal government might not be able to gain income from small businesses, for instance, when it comes to CIT, maybe from VAT they might be able to gain income, you would want to look at what other source of revenue or what is the most important metric that you should be considering at this point. And that's where we bring in the issue of the debt service to revenue ratio, which is quite high at the moment. I think it's sitting somewhere around 86%, right? And what that simply means, I'm sure you've heard of this before, what that simply means is that for every 1 naira that you're actually owing, you are going to be spending somewhere around 86 kobo to pay your to service that debt, right? So that's the simple implication. So what should Nigeria be doing? I think Nigeria should be focusing on its debt service to revenue ratio, trying to find out ways it can probably raise revenue, right? And if you look at the debt we're currently incurring, it's coming as a result of the fiscal deficits that we have. So there's a lot that needs to be done with respect to the fiscal deficit of the country. But so far so good. I think it's not something we should be worried about for now, but we should actually be looking at, in terms of the debt to GDP ratio, it's not something we should be worried about, but we should actually be looking at the debt service to revenue ratio, which is very important.
It's really scary. And looking at the fiscal spending widening too from 6% to about 6.4%. But my question is really this: do you think the coming government, we talked earlier, setting an agenda for the presidential candidates, do you think they can have that? Can they you see any aggressive cost-cutting measures? Do you understand that? Because it's clear now that our expenditure and recurrent volume is higher than placed side by side with capital expenditure. Do you see anything changing as we move on?
Well, to be honest with you, I don't think we should actually be focusing on cost-cutting measures. I think we should actually be focused on reallocation of spending, reallocation of resources. I think that's quite important, because to be quite honest with you, if you look at our current budget, right, 17 trillion in terms of expenditure, if you look at it in terms of dollars, right, in dollar terms, it's not quite much, because the exchange rate that we have right now is currently high. So we actually do need to spend a lot more at this point in time. And I think, like you rightly said, there is a lot of recurrent expenditure, right? So I think there needs to be a kind of reallocation such that you're actually spending a lot more on capital expenditure, right? You might have to forego some of, there is always that elephant in the room that talks about, when we talk about subsidy, right? And that's what is partly what is responsible for the current huge fiscal deficit that we have. If they're able to adjust for most of these distortions in the system, like Andrew rightly said, right? So if you're able to deal with these issues, you will find out that you probably don't have to incur this much in terms of inefficient spending. But when it now comes to efficient spending in things that will actually benefit the common man, by the time you make an investment in infrastructure, you are creating jobs, right? You are creating opportunity for even buying and selling of food, right? Because people will be working on such infrastructure, they will need to eat, right? So there is that multiplier effect around the economy, right? So it's important that you actually spend in times like this, especially when you are looking at the situation whereby you are trying to recover from a pandemic period, right? So there is a need for more spending, where it should be efficient, and there is a need for monitoring, right? Then also in terms of generating revenue, there needs to be efficiency. You need to plug loopholes. So all these things need to be put in place. And I think one important thing is, if you're able to eliminate corruption, I think technology to a reasonable extent can help address corruption. If you're able to address all these things together, I think Nigeria will be able to come out of its current
But let's consider all of the issues that we have now, the global issues, food shortage issues, the unrest, Russia in Ukraine, and all of that. Of course, post-COVID, but COVID's still on. Like they will say, we still need to be prepared and be guarded and take all our precautions. But what do you think will be the best case and worst case scenario for Nigeria in all of this? How do you see us coming out of it?
Well, not just Nigeria. I think a lot of countries
A lot
in
of
the
countries,
world,
yes.
a lot of countries in the world will be thinking about it, and it's a real challenge right now because the impact of the Russia-Ukraine war has simply prices are up, right? Global energy prices, food, fertilizer, and I think recently the IMF, the World Bank, they've been predicting that Africa, especially, there is going to be this global food insecurity issues that we're going to be facing. So I think what we can do at the moment right now is to try as much as possible to promote the economy, right? So like I said, there will be a lot of spending that will be needed at this point in time. A lot of spending will be required in terms of food security. First of all, like Andrew said, you need to address the issues of insecurity, right? Because most of the farmers that we have right now, they are worrying about going to the farm. We've had recent cases of people being kidnapped or people being killed, right? So these are issues that need to be addressed when it comes to security. Then also, when it comes to infrastructure, it's quite key. So it's important that, like I said, you have to channel these resources into the right places. You need to You need to, even if you are going to subsidize, right? The most important thing is that you should actually subsidize production, right, and not consumption. If you have to subsidize the common man, it needs to be channeled in such a way that it's actually the common man that is benefiting and not everyone that is benefiting from such things. So it's actually a very troublesome time. And if you even look at the report that was released by the IMF, they themselves have acknowledged it that most of the monetary authorities in Africa, as well as governments, they are going to have a tough time trying to maneuver the current challenges that we're facing. So it's going to be quite key that there is going to be a lot of fiscal support that is going to be given to businesses in terms of manufacturing, businesses also in terms of agriculture. So there's going to be a lot of support from both the government and also the monetary side. So that's what I see that Nigeria can do in these current times.
Of course, we are an importer of commodities like oil, wheat, and others, which we've alluded to. But let's look at what sort of economic blueprint do you think we could, fashion out that can help us address this, at least shore up the value of the naira, and how much economic buffers do we have to stabilize the economy?
Well, in terms of buffers, right, it's actually not much, and it's evident in the need why we have to still continue to borrow, right? And I'm sure recently, I'm sure you remember that Nigeria had to hold back on borrowing that 950 million euro bond. So even though I do expect that maybe towards the end of the year, we might still have to go back to the international capital market. So in terms of buffers, we actually don't have much, but in terms of export, like you rightly said, most of the things that we're exporting at the moment, 79% of our export has to do with crude oil, right? And we have 9% coming from natural gas. So in my opinion, and like Andrew rightly said, there's going to be a need for lots of exports in terms of human capital. Not necessarily, like he said, not necessarily having people go over there, but having people provide services, right, external services. Then also, I still think to a reasonable extent that we need to do a lot when it comes to the products, the primary products that we actually export, right? Things like the sesame seeds, things like the cocoa that we actually export. If you look at them, I know in the short term it might be difficult, but if you look at them, Africa as a whole, you pick Cote d'Ivoire, you pick Ghana, you pick Nigeria, about 40% or 30 to 40% of our cocoa exports, right? These three countries dominate about 30 to 40% of the market, the international market. But when it now comes to the refined products like the chocolates, right, it's not much. The control is not much. So I do think a lot needs to go into that, right? I mean, gradually, with time, you will find out that you begin to develop expertise in these things. So I think we need to do a lot when it comes to sending out manufactured products that have more value added, that are more value adding rather than the primary products themselves. So I think these are some of the things that we need to do within the medium term, right? It might not be straightforward, and one other important thing I need to mention is that when it comes to plans, we all know that we have lots of wonderful plans. If you remember the CBN RT200, the race to achieving $200 billion dollars in terms of export proceeds, right? There is one of those anchors that has to do with exporting value-added products. But the question now is how much of a traction have you seen since that was implemented? I think sometime in February or March. How much have you seen? We've not even heard much. So there needs to be more awareness, and I think there needs to be more involvement of the stakeholders. By the time you bring all these manufacturers together and you communicate these things to them, it's kind of bolsters that drive to want to make that export. But right now we don't hear much about these things. Right now what we are currently focused on is the politics, right?
Exactly.
Next year.
And what do you think what impact do you think that will have? Let's wrap up on that note on the economy if we continue like this, spending and all of that, liquidity in the economy.
Well, generally, if we keep going at the rate at which we are going, because we've heard about so much money being spent during this campaigning and thing, this election stuff, and it's quite worrying that we're actually putting a lot of money in the economy. And you know, I've heard wonderful stories about a lot of dollars going into the economy, and we have lots of manufacturers who are actually in need of the same amount of money, right? So I do think we need to be cautious when it comes to spending. I know the CBN is doing a lot in terms of mopping liquidity, but I also think as a government, as a people, we need to decide on what we want to do. And I think it will still boil down to who we are choosing as our next leader, because you don't want someone who is wasteful, or you don't want a situation whereby a lot of people are just trying to spend for consumption and they're actually not spending for production. So these are things that we need to factor in. But I think in the long run, I think maybe not this year, maybe next year, we can see a lot more traction in all these policies that we've put in place in terms of implementation. And I hope the next government that we have is actually going to follow most of these, is going to follow the ideas and policies that have actually been brought or have been initiated by the current government in terms of the National Development Plan, things like that. It's meant to run from 2021 to 2025, trying to raise 348 trillion naira. Are we going to continue in this line, or is the next government going to come up with something new? I just hope there is consistency in policies, because these are things that the international community is even looking at for them to come and invest in our country. So I hope maybe by next year, I hope we have a government that will be able to stabilize things and help us take us out of this current situation we're in.
Brilliant stuff there. An interesting conversation. I've been speaking to a tax manager, an economist at PricewaterhouseCoopers. He is Mr. Biodun Kayode Ali. Thank you so much for your submission and contribution to the show. Do enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you for having me, Tola.